right, we are back and we're talking about visiting colleges. And I'm super excited to welcome my colleague Serena Frisina, who also happens to be a former admissions officer at Lewis and Clark College in Oregon, to the show today because she has visited a lot of schools and she loves visiting schools. So, Serena, so happy to have you here.
Thank you. I am thrilled to be here.
Awesome. Well, so one of the things that I loved when you and I first met was you shared your own college experience, which included when you were looking at colleges, visiting 100 schools, which I love. I loved that. I could never stop talking about it. And it kind of blows my mind to imagine a high school senior visiting 100 colleges. But tell us a little bit about what prompted you to see that many schools.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't imagine like spending 4 years someplace that I didn't know a little bit more about and I hadn't visited. I had lived in the same place my whole life. And so at, 16 or so, I was like, I'm not going to just leave home and like move to a new strange place that I've never seen. So my mom and I spent, it was over a period of time. We did some spring break visits. California students have this fun February week-long break. So we did February breaks, spring breaks, and then we spent a summer visiting friends and family all over the country. We made it up to Canada. There was one particularly long, like 3-week cross country trip that ended ended at home, obviously, but ended on the West Coast. And we drove down the entire West Coast from BC to Southern California. And we went on tours at almost every single official campus tours on almost all of those 100 or so campuses. So it was, I apologize, I've got a dog here now. It was a ton of fun. I had a whole rating system. I don't remember it. It was a great time and we got to see friends and family and lots of schools.
So, first question for you is, did the school you wound up at, was that a school you visited?
Yes, it
Okay,
was one of my first visits.
interesting.
Yeah.
And along the way, so would you say that the average person needs to see as many schools as you saw?
No, no. And I'd like to clarify, I applied to 9 schools.
I
So I
love
wasn't
it.
like, a 30 school applicant. I definitely don't. I mean, I wouldn't not recommend 100 schools. Like it's fun. If you want to spend your time doing that, go for it. But you absolutely do not need to visit 100 schools. And you don't even need to visit all the schools that you apply to realistically.
Right. So it's interesting to me that the one you wound up at was one of the first schools that you visited. Any similarities amongst the 9 that you applied to? Were they early visits or were they kind of scattered throughout?
That's a good question. They were fairly scattered throughout. Yeah, a good mix. I think it really came down to what I experienced on those visits. And schools didn't make it on that list of 9 because I didn't like my visit on their campus. And the one thing I don't love about campus visits is they are superficial to some degree. I
Yeah.
mean, like it's not, you're not doing the deep dive research necessarily on your campus visit, but that gut feeling to me is really important in the process. And so I think that's where you get like that gut feeling on a campus visit. And I think that's why a lot of them kind of stayed on my list.
Got it. Because there was a gut reaction, positively or negative. Well,
Yeah.
stayed on your list positively, right? Never made it to the list is a negative reaction. And I just like how you guys kind of turned it into a, hey, well, this is something that is really important to me that I know I feel really comfortable about where I wind up for the next 4 years. So that just became your vacation anytime you had a chance to do it. So, and immediately what I thought is this is someone who can help families figure out how to wade through the options and how to maximize their visits. So with that in mind, for you, what are the essential elements of a visit? If you don't do these things, then you're not really visiting, or these things are essential to really saying, yes, I visited and looked at this school.
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on the student. But I think some of the key components are going on the official campus tour whenever you possibly can.
Mhm.
I think, yes, you get some kind of marketed information that the campus tour guide is trained, but you want a trained person. You want somebody who knows how to show you all the important pieces. So I think those campus tours, the official tours, are important. I think that kind of lesser known, or something that maybe you wouldn't think to do, um, I definitely think spending some time in the surrounding area, if you can, going to a restaurant, exploring where you would get off campus, especially in a rural area. Like, what can you get to easily?
Mhm.
I like what I call the coffee shop eavesdrop, a little tongue twister, like in a coffee shop or a dining hall on campus, and listen to the conversations around you. Are those like, is that what you would want to spend your next 4 years hearing and like talking about? Um, I think for some students, seeing facilities, whether that's athletic or research facilities, like if you want to be doing research on a college campus and that's how you want to spend your college experience, try to get in to see those facilities. And I find, faculty, students are really excited to show off their work. So that can be an email to the admissions office or an email to a professor that you're interested in working with potentially. I think for some students, the library is really important to see. You're going to spend a lot of time in that library.
Yes.
Um, I also think asking the tour guide or the people that you meet on campus, like, where is your favorite place that perhaps the tour doesn't go? And that can be on and off campus. Like, where do you spend your time when you're not in class? I think residence halls can be important. They can also be tricky. Like, you don't want to go through residence halls and interrupt student, like that's their homes. It's a little weird. But I think when that's offered, or if you have a friend that's going to the school, definitely take advantage of popping in and seeing a room, if that's an option.
Yeah, yeah. I love all of those ideas, and I think the tour is important. I'm as a former admissions officer, I'm super partial always to the info session, possibly because I used to lead those, so I'm like, well, of course those are important. What I like about those is that sometimes, not always though, interestingly enough, but sometimes I find that's where you can get some really good applying information. I attended a couple, did a bunch before my son was looking at colleges, but it certainly took on new meaning when I was going with my son. And, I was almost exclusively focused on, I don't know what he was paying attention to, but I was paying attention to what they say about, do you need to be in the early action pool? Are there priority deadlines? Is there something that they like to see in if there's an additional essay required that students write about in that essay? Like if it's an admissions officer leading it, I was usually getting some really good advice from that perspective. But it isn't always led by an admissions officer, and I certainly found that unlike the tour, which is a pretty reliable, what you're going to get with the tour, the info session varied from school to school for me.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're absolutely helpful, and I would totally agree if you can make them, definitely. I think the info session is the easiest thing to do, like virtually or off campus.
Yes.
If you need to miss something, like you can usually figure out a way to get that information through other avenues. But if you can, definitely info session.
And see, actually, that's really great advice. And I've never entirely thought about it that way. But one of the challenges of seeing a lot of schools, and you could probably speak to this better than I could, is just how many visits can you really do in one day? And if you're trying to do both a tour and an info session, and then do some of those other things that you're mentioning, really it's one school a day. But if you could do the info session online and then do a tour and a couple of other things, in theory, you might actually fit two schools in one day. What are your thoughts on that? And did you ever fit more than two schools into one day?
Yeah, definitely. Again, it depends on the area. If you are in your neck of the woods, a one school a day visit, I think, is pretty much max, unless you're waking
Yes.
up next to the school and then like hitting the second school as late as possible.
Yes.
I think if you're in my area in Portland, you realistically can can hit two. If you're strategic and fueled up on good Portland coffee, you might be able to hit three schools. I notice a lot of schools that are in that kind of work together, peer schools, sometimes they will time their visits. So it is possible
Mm,
to, eat lunch on the way or between schools and do a morning visit and an afternoon visit. I find if you're doing that, that's not sustainable. It's really, really exhausting. On most campus tours, you are walking miles. I mean,
hmm.
in many places, if you're not doing a shuttle tour, which I think we did of the 100 or so visits, maybe two tours that were on
Oh,
shuttles.
wow.
The
Okay.
rest of them were walking tours. So, and that's kind of, I'm now bird walking here. But, two visits is a lot. So I'd say, aim for one, maybe a few places you can hit those two visits.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's really good advice because I also think if you're not being thoughtful in the visits and you're not doing some of those additional things, right, you're not going to get as much out of it. And then you've spent all this money and time to kind of come away saying, oh, I like the tour. I don't really remember much more. Um, and so, really quickly, because there's a few things I want to cover here, but um, I'm assuming you must have taken notes when you were doing all of those visits. I see that as essential. Any advice for you on how to keep everything organized so that it doesn't all bleed together?
Yeah, I definitely recommend picking up brochures, even if they're mailed home, if they have paper on the table. And I'm a paper person, so this might depend on who you are, but I would grab a brochure. Just, it has a few pictures, it has the information, it's kind of there in front of me. Sometimes I would write my notes on the brochure. So it was like all there in a nice little packet.
Hmm.
Definitely take, at this point, you can do it on your phone. That wasn't really an option on my flip phone. But you can, type your notes on a phone. And I would just say, point out anything to jog your memory. I had some weird, like, oh, remember like tying your shoe in this weird place, like things that would just help me remember, like I spilled my coffee here. But take notes and on paper or on your phone. And if you have a way to sort of rate your visit, I think that can be helpful. And you might have a few categories like, liked these things, didn't like these things, but just, anything to help you remember your experience there and that feeling you got. Like, what did you feel while you were there?
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of speaks to the gut reaction you were talking about, right? And it's the analogy I always make is, you're dating, someone could look really great on paper, and then you meet them and no. And it's a pretty immediate like, nope, this is definitely not someone for me, even if they're great on paper. And it can be that way with a college. And it also can be a wow. Ideally, they also meet your primary criteria or you wouldn't visit, but sometimes there's no explaining it why something really appeals and something really doesn't. But the visits can be helpful in that way. Um, Really quickly, any tips for families on actually planning the visits? Where do you go to start that process?
There is usually a page on the admissions website, and it usually has a calendar. I think they come so naturally to me now, but they can be a little bit confusing. So if you're ever running into problems, just email the admissions office, or if you have a good relationship with your territory counselor from the school, reach out to them. I would formally schedule the visit in advance. I think there are still some COVID restrictions in place, or at least the remnants of COVID restrictions. So sometimes you can't do a walk-in visit. So pre-planning is really helpful. And
Yeah.
mapping distances between places and anticipating traffic so that you're not late to your visit.
Right, and also understanding where you're going to park. That's a big one if you're driving. But I could second anticipating traffic. I was always amazed when I worked in admissions at the number of families who would come walking in, like at the time that the info session started. At the time, you didn't really register in advance, but we had a card that we wanted people to fill out, and then we had to walk to the place where we were doing the info session and it's not ideal if you're showing up exactly at the time it's supposed to start, because even if we knew it was going to start 5 minutes later, your being delayed could either delay everything or you would get left behind and have to kind of find your way and to catch up. So great advice. Serena, thank you so much for joining today and sharing your personal experience. I love it. And I don't know anyone who has kind of taken that part of their college search so seriously. And I just think it's great. So thanks for joining today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Beth.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks to Serena and all of my guests today. Next week, Ian is hosting, and he's going to be talking about transferring. We have had a few segments throughout the year about transferring, but that segment is going to be on the nuts and bolts of it. How do you do it? We're also going to be talking about education tax breaks, which it's tax time, so it's that time of year. And we're going to be doing a listener Q&A, one of our regular segments. I mentioned at the beginning of the show, please don't forget, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. The more we get, the easier it is for others to find us. Remember, it's getting in a college coach conversation. We love those 5-star reviews. If you have questions, we answer them in those listener Q&A segments. So send them to us. You can send them to us at Facebook, Instagram, or at collegecoachbh, or you can just send good old fashioned email, gettingin.voiceamerica@gmail.com. And last thing I wanted to mention is just if you're curious if we've covered a topic of interest before, we blog about every single podcast that we do. That's a lot of blogs about our podcasts. But you can go to our blog at getintocollege.com, blog.getintocollege.com, and search there for whatever topic is of interest, and you can find the different segments we've done on that topic and then go listen to them. And don't forget, we are here every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Pacific.